Mindfulness is believed to have been one of the core teachings of the Buddha and a key ingredient in the path to liberation, what's called the Noble Eightfold Path. So we have good reason to be curious and to kind of look into what is this teaching about. And it's no wonder that mindfulness has become such a big deal in the West over the past 5 decades or so. And the place to look where we find the most detailed description of the practice is in the famed Satipatthana Sutta, what's often translated as the Discourse on the Foundations of Mindfulness. So that's what we'll look into in this video. What is the discourse and what are the foundations of mindfulness? Before we begin though, I want to point out that there are many forms of Buddhism and many different types of interpretations. So this way of presenting the teaching is mostly associated with the early forms of Buddhism, sometimes called the Theravada or the School of the Elders. And there are many interesting parallels, similarities, but also differences in the Zen and the Mahayana tradition, for example, as well as in the Tibetan, Vajrayana, and more tantric forms of Buddhism. So here I'll be presenting the teachings of mindfulness in the way that I'm more familiar with in terms of practice, which is the Vipassana or the insight meditation tradition. So in this discourse, we're invited to bring the quality of mindfulness to 4 domains of our lives. And these 4 domains or foundations actually make up the entire field of our human experience. So these 4 foundations are, and we'll look into these in turn in future videos, but the 4 foundations are mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of our breath, mindfulness of the entire experience of being embodied, mindfulness of feelings, feeling tones that we go throughout our days and our lives. And the third one is mindfulness of mind, mindfulness of the states of mind and mindfulness of moods. 4th foundation of mindfulness is mindfulness of Dhammas. This is perhaps better left untranslated, but for now we can just say mindfulness of objects of mind or contents of awareness. So this includes our entire sensory experience as well as what we could call universal contents of awareness. So we bring awareness to unfoldments that happen on the path, all the way to liberation, all the way to nibbana or nirvana. And this is why the path of mindfulness in the Satipatthana Sutta is called the direct path to liberation. And this is liberation from a mistaken identity, essentially. This is what's often called spiritual awakening. It's like waking up. So just as we wake up in the morning, we wake up from a dream, in the same way we can wake up from the illusion of separation and fixed identity. In other words, we wake up from our normal sensation of being an isolated ego inside a bag of skin, as Alan Watts would put it. It's an illusion that, although necessary and useful as we go through life, is the source of our suffering. Or more specifically, an identification with this sense of self is the source of suffering. So now we're getting way ahead of ourselves. So let's take a step back and recap what is mindfulness. And essentially we're talking about an inherent human capacity that can be cultivated, that can be trained. The word mindfulness comes from the Pali term sati, and it means to be awake, to be aware and present with our moment-by-moment experience, with a quality of kindness, learning to befriend what shows up in our lives. And it also has a reflective aspect to it, and it involves an intention to come back and abide in this state of mindfulness. So we're developing also a sense of what we could call a meta-awareness, so that whenever our mind wanders, we can become conscious of that and we can bring ourselves back to mindfulness. So through the 4 foundations, we're invited to bring this particular quality of mindfulness to the entirety of our lives. So even though meditation practice can be seen as the formal way in which we cultivate the capacity of mindfulness, the practice extends beyond the cushion. So we don't have to wait until we can sit down and meditate in order to practice. We also don't have to wait until all the circumstances in our lives are perfect. You know, sometimes we have the feeling that the life situations become obstacles to our inner development, for example. That once I've done this, once I've completed that or solved that problem, once I have more time, once I'm in a calm state of mind, then I can practice mindfulness. So these are all excuses and defenses by the ego in order not to look too closely at our experience. So we need to retrain that habit pattern of postponement. Mindfulness happens now. And because as we know, the circumstances will hardly ever be perfect. But in fact, that's not a problem in terms of our inner development and our cultivation of mindfulness. Quite the contrary, that we work with whatever life presents us. It's like they say in Zen, that the obstacle is the path. Okay, so how do we begin to do this? How do we actually practice? And what's nice about this teaching is how practical it is. It really directs us to exactly how do we bring mindfulness to each of the 4 domains. So, for example, you may be aware of mindfulness of breathing. And this is one of the first instructions. It's the way in which we begin to enter into the body, because the breath is always there. You can reflect on that right now, coming back to your breath, that whether you were aware of the breath before or not, the breath is there and is always available for us to bring awareness and intention and clear comprehension into the body. We can begin to contemplate the body in this way. And from there, the practice moves on from the gross to the more increasingly subtle aspects throughout the 4 foundations. So it's not that the foundations are, sequential, or that they are like levels of practice where we move from one to the other. It's more like a wheel, like a continually deepening process in which we practice different aspects at different times. So the 4 foundations of mindfulness, they are means of bringing awareness and looking deeply into any experience that we ever have as human beings. So think about that. What can be more interesting than that? That the experience of being alive is the arena in which we practice mindfulness. Nothing is excluded. And what's wonderful about the practice is the clarity that it provides on both the purpose to liberation and also on the practice of how we begin to bring mindfulness to each of these foundations. And that's what we'll look at in the next set of videos. And as we practice, as we progress on the path, we begin to train these inherent and natural capacities, what we could call psychotechnologies, that help bring about spiritual awakening. And as we do, we're also going to experience plenty of positive side effects on the way as well. And the teaching, it doesn't say or dictate what your experience will be or what the liberation means to you. It simply provides you with the tools and it points the way, and then the discovery is up to you. So you become the scientist of your inner experience and of your inner self.